Alexander the Great rose to the throne of the dangerous kingdom of Macedon. He had to deal with wars, revolutions, and assassinations fueled by internal strife. Macedon was powerful, but being its prince was no guarantee of his safety. Even one of his closest relatives, and the most powerful man in the country, succumbed to the violence after being betrayed. Yet these are challenges Alexander would overcome with relative ease and grow into the most powerful man the world had ever seen. This is how Alexander the Great almost took over the world. Looking at old statues of Alexander, you may have thought he was quite a dashing fella, but the real story isn't so favourable. He was shorter than most, couldn't grow a decent beard unlike other barons, and his neck was twisted in a way that made him look like he was gazing at an upward angle. He also had a condition known as heterochromia, where one eye is a different colour to the other. In his case, one eye was blue and the other was brown. Before Alexander even became king, he was forced to put down revolts himself when his father was away campaigning. A revolt broke out, which Alexander put down by driving them out of their territory. He then colonized it with Greeks and founded the city of Alexandropolis. This strategy of colonizing hostile territory makes it harder for them to revolt and allows you to slowly take it over with your own people. It's now almost impossible for that territory to be united against Macedon. Alexander was able to think clearly and logically. This trait of his can partly be attributed to great teaching. Aristotle himself was Alexander's teacher from the age of 13 to 16. Alexander considered many scholars before deciding on Aristotle, and even went as far as to revive his destroyed hometown of Stagira. He bought and freed citizens who had been sold as slaves. He pardoned those in exile and rebuilt the town. After this, Aristotle became his teacher at the boarding school Mieza. The day Alexander became king might have been one of the best and worst days of his life. He certainly would have had mixed feelings. Glad about becoming king, but probably distraught with how it happened. In 336 BC, Alexander's father Philip II, as well as Alexander himself, some of his friends who were known as the companions, as well as numerous other important people, were attending a wedding. The wedding in question was between Philip's daughter Cleopatra to Alexander I of Epirus. During the wedding, Philip II, the current king, was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguards. The captain tried to escape, but tripped over a vine and got caught by pursuers, two of which were Alexander's companions. Alexander was proclaimed king on the spot. Alexander was only 20 years old when he became king, but during his reign he would display the tactics and wisdom of someone much his senior. And in only a few short years, through a rapid series of events, he would change the world drastically. After becoming king, Alexander was struck by disaster. His father's death had not only devastated him, but sent shockwaves throughout their territory. People were waking up to the fact that Philip II was dead, and that the empire was now in a weakened state. They knew that now would be the time to rebel. Many civilizations started rising up in revolt against Macedon, and the great country he had inherited from his father was in danger of falling apart. Alexander was advised to use diplomacy and attempt to appease them, but he had other ideas. Alexander took a more direct approach. He put together an army of 3,000 cavalry and rode out in person to confront these armies. One example is when he outmaneuvered the Thessalian army. They were stationed in a valley between Mount Olympia and Mount Ossa. He marched over Mount Ossa, and when they awoke, they found him in their rear. Taken completely by surprise, they surrendered immediately. Once Alexander consolidated his power and secured his kingdom, he turned his heterochromatic eyes towards the Persian Empire. Ruled by Darius III, now 22 years old, he declared war on the Persians. The three major battles of this war being the Battle of Granicus, the Battle of Issus, and the Battle of Gaugamela. For most of his battles with the Persians, he would be vastly outnumbered. But Alexander wasn't daunted by this. His mother had taught him from a young age that he was destined to conquer the Persians. Alexander won the Battle of Granicus against a Persian army led by a Greek mercenary. He won this battle with relative ease, which made enough of an impact on the Persian Empire to draw out a big fish: the Emperor of the Persian Empire himself, Darius III. Darius marched behind Alexander in order to cut off his supply lines, making it harder for Alexander to support his army. Alexander responded by marching towards Darius's forces. They met at the Panaris River. Alexander had a formidable force of 40,000 men. Darius had between 60,000 and 108,000. I don't have to point out how big a disadvantage that is for Alexander. Yet it didn't seem to pose any problem for him. Using superior tactics and arming his men with superior weapons, Alexander dominated the battle. Darius lost 20,000 men and had to flee for his life. Alexander lost a measly 452 men. This was a disaster for Darius, not just because he lost so many men, but for the sheer embarrassment of losing the battle against a much smaller force. Not only that, but the Persian Empire had never suffered a defeat while Darius was present, and he was so confident that he would win that he brought his wife, his mother, and his daughters with him while travelling, all of which were kidnapped by Alexander. Alexander even went on to marry Darius' daughter to Tyra II. This victory led to the third major battle. In the Battle of Gaugamela, Darius came back with an even larger force than before. This time Alexander had 47,000 men, and Darius had 90,000 to 120,000. Alexander would still manage to emerge victorious in this fight, due to superior tactics. After this victory, he gained Babylon, half of Persia, and all other parts of Mesopotamia. Darius managed to escape with some forces, and planned to raise another army to fight Alexander once again. He sent messages to all his satraps, asking them to remain loyal to him. However, one of Darius' satraps by the name of Bessus murdered Darius instead. Alexander was disappointed to see someone he respected so much die in such a way. He gave Darius a full burial, then caught and executed Bessus. Most of the remaining satraps gave their loyalty to Alexander. Now Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, just like his mother predicted. But he didn't stop there. His goal was to conquer the world. Part of the reason for Alexander's success was the sarissa, a unique spear developed by his father. It was longer than most spears, and much more effective because of this reach advantage. Philip II trained his soldiers to use the spear, which they were unfamiliar with at first, but once they were able to use it well, they were unstoppable. By the end of Philip's reign, the small nation of Macedon had gone from weak to powerful. It wasn't just Alexander's leadership, but the tools he had inherited from his father, which allowed him to be so successful. However, his final conquest would prove to be his hardest, as he marched into India. Alexander initiated the Indian campaign in 326 BC. The Greeks believed at this time that India was located at the end of the world, which means Alexander probably felt he was nearing his goal of world domination. Alexander advanced into Punjab, where he fought with the Indian king Porus on the banks of the river Hydaspes. This was the most costly battle Alexander ever fought. Porus had a formidable army that put up a strong resistance. Alexander dealt with Porus's elephants by opening his ranks to envelop the elephants and attacking the riders with sarissas. During the battle, Alexander decided to cross the monsoon-swollen river despite close Indian surveillance, in order to catch Porus's army in the flank. Although Alexander managed to win the fight, he was so impressed with Porus that he offered to make him one of his satraps. Despite winning, the battle was so hard fought that Alexander's men refused to go any further, and eventually they were forced to turn back. Alexander's long campaign had ended, and it had ended without him suffering a single defeat. He died in 323 BC, at the age of 32. By the end of his life, he had created one of the largest empires in history, increased trade, founded cities, and created countless legends, such as him having a relationship with the Queen of the Amazons. If he hadn't been forced to turn back, due to the fear and exhaustion of his men, he might have conquered the world.